And we are live, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Martin van Staden. I am joined today by usual suspects, David Ansara and Zakhele Mthembu from the Free Market Foundation, my colleagues. And we have a very special guest today in the form of Leigh-Ann Hallak, perhaps better known on X or Twitter as @SkyZA. I would say probably one of the most sensible accounts on the platform that kind of spit fire and truth in our crazy times. Leigh-Ann is also a Rational Standard contributor. She's written some of our well, I wouldn't say some of our best performing articles consistently for the last month have been Leigh-Ann's, and she's known for being quite a big critic, rightly so, of mainstream media, of censorship, and of course a proponent, along with the rest of us, of free speech and liberty, just in general. So, welcome, Leigh-Ann. I just want to give you a moment to just make yourself known to our audience. I think most of our Rational Standard subscribers are familiar with your work, but yeah, well, welcome to the pod.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Martin, and thanks for having me.
Mm.
I'm looking forward to the
Yeah,
chat.
yeah, absolutely. And I think today we are discussing something that I think all of us probably can get quite animated on. And that is two things that really do hang together. The one is that tomorrow, so I know most of our viewers don't watch us live, but today is the 13th. It's a Friday the 13th, perhaps aptly so. Friday the 13th of June. And tomorrow is obviously Saturday the 14th of June. And a year ago, on the 14th of June, 2024, something very peculiar happened in South Africa, and that is when the so-called government of national unity was established between primarily the African National Congress and the Democratic Alliance. And there are, of course, a few other smaller political parties that make up the GNU. But it's now been a year of the GNU, and I must first do a an admission that I was wrong. One of my big predictions about the GNU. I've been right about many of my other predictions of the GNU, so you can take those to the bank. But the one I was very wrong about was that I expected it to fall apart very quickly, and I nailed my colors to the mast of saying that I don't think it will last a year. So now the year has come. Unless the GNU collapses in the next 24 hours, the year has come, and I was wrong. So hats off to the people in the GNU who misgovern us. They have kept the coalition together, perhaps on a bit of a shaky ground, but this has now existed for a year. I think we're gonna get into that and whether this has been a success or a failure. I think many of our viewers will know where I would lean on that. And the other topic that very much lives kind of with this is that this week our president Cyril Ramaphosa announced the so-called national dialogue. Now, this is one of the items in the GNU statement of principles, or whatever they called it when it was formed, that there was going to be this inclusive process where South Africans from all walks of life will get together and chart the next chapter in the history of our democracy, or something along those lines. Very much, I think, a policy focused idea at the time. What will be the agenda of this new government where no one has a majority? Um, and nothing really has happened until now. So the Thabo Mbeki Foundation tried to arrange its own national dialogue. I'm not sure what happened with that. In November of last year, Helen Zille criticized the ANC for being unilateralist with its national dialogue plans. And now, suddenly, the president has announced that there is going to be a national dialogue. There's going to be a first national convention. I don't know why he called it that. It's a strong word in the South African political context, but that's now going to be held in August, and that will set the agenda for the actual national dialogue, which will come later. And a list of imminent persons have been announced, and these people will now drive the process and be the guarantors of the kind of inclusive participation. And I think it's it's a farce, and I just want to give credit to Willie Spies on taking the of kind of coining what I would consider this to be as a national monologue, and he wrote it in Nuusweek, which is the paper of Pretoria FM. It's where Willie Spies said that it's a nationale monologue rather than a dialogue. So let's get started. I think Leigh-Ann, maybe since you're the newbie on the pod today, maybe give your initial impressions of what do you think about this announcement and where this could go. You're muted, Leigh-Ann.
Sorry. To be honest, I don't really see the point of this national dialogue. Willie Spies is quite right in saying it's going to be a monologue, but we often provide input on policy and those types of things in the form of public participation. And government often they don't even consider the input. So what is different about a national dialogue? What will change? I doubt anything significant will come from it. I think we're going to have a lot of people just sitting and nodding their heads and agreeing with one another. And it doesn't look like it's a group of very diverse people from diverse political ideologies. I don't see solidarity there. I don't see AfriForum. I don't see the FMF or the IRR. It's all the usual people who agree with Cyril and toe the line. So, yeah, I don't see anything positive coming from this, or anything different for that matter.
Yeah, David, if you want to take a bite.
Yeah, look, I haven't checked my spam folder, so maybe there's an invitation from the presidency there, but I'll
Don't
do
hold
that
your
after
breath.
the pod. Yeah, I suspect that the FMF's invitation got lost in the mail. But look, I think Leigh-Ann is absolutely right. South Africa loves these kind of multi-stakeholder forums, and I think underlying that concept that Willie Spies used, the monologue, I think that's very apt, because ultimately it's the government talking to itself, or the ANC talking to itself. And I think it's, it's got this veneer of diversity. So it has sports people and beauty queens and businessmen and religious leaders and so on. But ultimately, I think it's going to be one directional communication. And I think the danger there is that the ANC will use that opportunity to reinforce its policy status quo, its ideological worldview, and then use that to legitimize its poor governance and track record in general. So yeah, I mean, you often hear people saying, "Oh, we need a CODESA 2 or 3." Actually, there were 2 CODESAs originally, and that we need an economic CODESA. And I've always been kind of skeptical of it, because I think it's more talk shops and so on. But in some ways, we do actually need to have a very serious conversation about policy. And what that entails, I think, is also an understanding that there have to be trade-offs in this conversation, that some people are going to need to sacrifice part of their interests for the sake of the whole. I mean, I know we're pretty skeptical about collective interests, because it's very hard to adequately represent the interests of all 60 million plus South Africans. But ultimately, we need conflict, actually, rather than consensus. And I think there's too much consensus seeking. It's been a characteristic of the Ramaphosa presidency in general. And if you consider all the investment roadshows, everybody stands up and they give their piece, but ultimately nothing comes of it. So yeah, I think we need a hard conversation. I don't know if this national dialogue is that hard conversation. I suspect not. But we are at a critical juncture as a country, and I think some sacrifice is going to have to be made. And ultimately, the conversation should be a policy conversation. So with respect to the beauty queens and the sports stars, I think we actually need some serious adults in the room talking about the different political and economic interests in the country, and how we can unlock growth, how we can break the status quo, because the status quo isn't working.
Yeah, Zakes, you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I don't know whether. First, I agree, with I hate talk shops. I don't know who will be paying for this, because I don't like my taxes being used for
Yeah, I know
any
who's
of
gonna
this
pay for
stuff.
it, and you know who's gonna pay for it.
But yeah, that is always my worry, right? With commissions of inquiries, I remember what was the first clip I ever saw of Leon was where he was on Morning Live on SABC, was talking about the first time I ever knew about the FMF, was talking about how kangaroo courts, like, commissions of inquiries are kangaroo courts. And ever since then, I've always been very skeptical every time I see one. And this seems just like, in the same vein of just like, hey, let's just waste people's money, pay a whole lot of lawyers and caterers and event organizers. Everyone will eat, at least those people. But I don't see the whole point of it. I think I agree generally. Nothing ever comes from it. But like in the broader sense, nothing should come from it. I think, like, since we live in a democracy, horrible as it may be, right? There are some aspects of it, but where policy discussions happen are when people actually go and vote for the people that they choose to elect. So like this idea that, like, there will be this dialogue, and there'll be, as to use David's words, the adults in the room. The adults in the room can talk all they want, but like if people disagree with that, then there's nothing that can be done. And I think, this idea, South Africa still operates on that vein. I think the US is like coming out of that by, like, people are like, no, we won't listen to the adults in the room. We will just vote how we deem fit, right? So I think that, like, that should be the focus. I think in South Africa we've lost track of it. Maybe it's given the most recent events, right? We've seen an opportunity for influence. Of course, we hope that influence is exerted for better policies outside of, the election cycle. But I think we've lost track of, like, the basis of all governance everywhere is that people vote for the people that they want to vote for, and that is where the conflict should happen. And like these dialogues, for me, I hate them for that. Really, like they seem useless, because I don't want any dialogue, even the one that has even, like, the FMF and IR, Afriforum and Solidarity, and even right down to the African Socialist Workers Party, like all that. I don't want that dialogue to create policy for me outside of the mechanism that the Constitution has established. So one that I do disagree with too, in some aspects of it, but I don't want that to be where policy stems from. I want my vote to actually mean something. Advocacy, at the very least, what is attractive to me from it is that I get to convince people that, my ideas are better than their not so great ideas. So yeah, this idea that, we need certain people to decide the trajectory of the country is quite problematic to me on a personal level. And then, of course, I just don't want my taxes being used for that stuff. So yeah, there's that.
Yeah, I think there's some value to that, and maybe specifically on how this national dialogue almost seems like a coping mechanism for a bunch of politicians who don't trust in the well, it's not an explicit constitutional provision, but the implication of our constitution is that once a political party no longer has a majority, it must form a coalition. And coalitions and minority governments are built ultimately on negotiations and concessions. So the ANC has lost the election. That means that if it wants X law to be passed by parliament, it must go to other parties and negotiate for that law to be adopted. And I mean, we've seen some of that. But fundamentally, you see that the ANC is very uncomfortable with this. It wants, and I mean, I'm not just going to pick on the ANC. I think the DA, for instance, was also very excited about a national dialogue of a sort. And I think they all want there to be a cohesive single vision, that now you don't have to negotiate anymore. We agree to this thing, and then that's how we do it. I think there's the one problem with that is that it's an inappropriate coping mechanism with how coalition politics are meant to work. And secondly, which I mean you've all alluded to now, is that even if the FMF and the IRR and Solidarity and AfriForum were present, it would make no difference whatsoever. We would have a conversation, and I mean, the Free Market Foundation has been involved in talk shops and workshops and so on with state departments for decades, for 5 decades now, and at least for the last 2 decades, this has meant nothing. It uniformly, you always get a good engagement with lawmakers and policymakers, and they say, wow, geez, thank you for this. This is such a good analysis, and we didn't think about that. And wow, we're definitely going to take this, that, and the other thing into account. But where the rubber meets the road, where the policy is actually made and where the law is actually made, it is top to bottom ANC preferred policy. The ANC has never adopted a policy in this country that it is not comfortable with. That doesn't mean that it didn't listen to new ideas, but all those new ideas are ideas that it is comfortable with adopting. You think of the Child Justice Act, which was created by the Child Law Clinic at the University of Pretoria, for example. That didn't come from the ANC, but when that was tabled to the ANC, they thought, well, no harm, no foul. Let's adopt this law. So the ANC will not adopt anything that goes against its fundamental kind of its non-negotiables, to say that. And I mean, some other people are picking up on this. So I looked at some of the press coverage from the Star, which is from 2 days ago. Political analyst from UKZN, Siyabonga Ntombela, he said that all these luminaries are effectively somehow connected with Cyril Ramaphosa. You don't see anyone connected with the DA there. You don't see anyone connected even with MK, with Jacob Zuma's faction. You don't see any of them there. So this is not a representative, a politically representative group of people who are meant to steward this process. And I think Ramaphosa was himself very clear about this. He said, and I quote from his announcement of the national dialogue. He says, "We are called upon to give all sectors of our society," and then he explains what this means: men and women, young and old, persons with disabilities, LGBTQI community, and urban and rural people, a voice to determine how we address the problems of today and build the South Africa we want for our future generations. So the way he perceives, and I mean, this is not just him, but a large number of people in our country perceive diversity and kind of all sectors of society is kind of these inborn characteristics. It's like you're a man or you're a woman, you're young or you're old, you're disabled or you're not, you are gay or you're not, or you were born kind of in a rural area or not. It's nothing to do with kind of how you voted, what you think how South Africa should work. So it's a farce from the start. It's a farce from the start because they're already the premise of representation here is already based on something completely irrelevant. It's not about actually discovering, wow, the ANC lost the election, no one really won the election, so how are we going to bring all these competing worldviews together in a cohesive national policy? None of that is present. So this is really just going to be, as X alluded to, I think, like the commissions of inquiry. It's like, oh God, we don't know what to do about this problem. Let's establish a commission or a dialogue or a workshop, and then they'll talk about it, and then we'll pretend like something has changed. Obviously not. Obviously that is not the case here. And the harm that David alluded to is what we must all bear foremost in mind as we go about engaging with this. And that is that at the end of this process, and I doubt that there's going to be an end to this process, we know how these things go, but at the theoretical end of this process, we're going to have what I am fairly certain is going to be a recommitment to this triple challenges of poverty, unemployment, and inequality. And it's going to be ANC stuff, and it's going to be a recommitment to including the private sector in these important kind of problem solving of the government. It's going to be a recommitment to all the base, to inclusive growth. It's going to be a recommitment to all these things, and the idea that, well, we're actually now going to deal with corruption and so on. It's going to be the same as this CEO. I don't even recall what they called it, like about a year ago. Some business and government thing came together, and it was all of this stuff. And I think we're just going to see that again with no change. So we just have to be aware of that, because it's going to co-opt the idea of opposition, and then we need to resist that very fiercely. David, I see you have your mic unmuted. You're something
Yeah,
to
I
add.
think Zax also wants to jump in, but I'll just say quickly, just off the back of Zax's earlier comment, yeah, there is kind of a sinister undertone here that it is risking subverting the democratic process and undermining the normal mechanisms in which we make public policy decisions. So I think we should be alive to that risk. And then your point, Martin, I think is also valid. Often, and this pertains to the GNU as well, in a more broad sense, often what we see with these discussions is that even though the ANC, everyone agrees that it's weak, historic low electoral performance, lack of capacity to implement a lot of its policies, etc., running out of money, all of those things. But ultimately in South Africa, the ANC still sets the policy agenda in this country. So, and you can think of anything. It'll be, okay, well, we have this policy called BE. We all agree that transformation, as the ANC defines it, is important. And so let's debate what form of BE we must have. And ultimately, what that does is it distracts attention from the fact that this is ultimately a political enrichment scheme for connected cadres. It's not about the very valid and legitimate objective of improving the lives and livelihoods of ordinary Black South Africans. It's about elite enrichment. Same with NHI. Oh, we all agree that we need some massive national health fund. And what do you guys think of it? Oh, well, maybe we could have a bit less stringency on some of these requirements. Can we afford it? I'm not so sure. But ultimately, hey, it's the ANC that's putting this idea forward, and now we all discuss. So I think if we really take South Africa's diverse interests seriously, we should also be able to have a sense of like, all right, there should be countervailing forces and alternative policies that the ANC starts debating. I mean, I think maybe, Martin, on privatization of energy provision, I think there's been some progress there. And I think that is an example of where the ANC kind of reluctantly conceded after years of a failed centralized state system. But we need more of that. We need more of the pushback against ANC policy. And we should also just resist this idea of triangulating, like, oh, could we have a kind of a slightly better form of NHI or expropriation without compensation? The answer should just be no. There's a line here and you guys just crossed it and you must get back over the line. So, yeah, I think we need much more kind of real hard politics in South Africa.
Yeah,
Zakes, and then we'll come back to Leigh-Ann.
Yeah, cool. I will agree with actually what David has said. I think we need a clear, discussion of issues. More to Martin's point, really, the most important thing is the diversity of thoughts. Why these talk shops usually, if they're hosted by the state or anyone state adjacent, if I were to call them that, is that they usually end up just reproducing the very same things, right? The same ideas that this thing is needed, and really we are talking about degrees of its need. Now we're just talking about degrees of its implementation. And I find that, for me at a personal level, I love competition policy, and my ideal situation is for competition policy not to be a thing that exists, right? And the reason I take such a radical, perspective when it comes to it is because I feel like, when you don't become radical, the conflicts that David was talking about, I am a huge fan of, and I want it to be expressed in ideas, and I want people to actually see ideas for what they are and actually talk about them rather than, facilitating conversations where we are talking about degrees of the same horrible idea. But radicalism is great because you get to just explore something at its most, at times, absurd position, but it makes it much more clearer to someone that I am opposed to this thing and I am not a fan of it. So it's the same thing with NHI. I feel like with NHI, they are succeeding in making it the norm. And now we will eventually get to the point whereby, through this piecemeal litigation that I'm a huge fan of, right? But through piecemeal litigation, we may get some victory here, some victory there. But I think that the fundamental issue of it all will not go away. Same thing with like, BE and any other, horrible real estate interventionist policy that the ANC has come up with. So I find that to be pretty horrible. And then to the point of like having national dialogues, right? Like in South Africa, we love duplicating, processes. I've been researching a whole lot on competition law, and competition law is pretty much through, in the previous administration was used to duplicate BEE and affirmative action and all these other legislations. And now we are seeing this national dialogue, right? NEDLAC, I think, is supposed to be that the dialogue place where businesses and diverse interests in the states and trade unions and all these players that are so critical, at least to our economic life, meet and discuss policies. But usually what comes out of NEDLAC is just a rubber stamping of whatever it is comes out of Luthuli House, right? And that is not good. But that is why I'm also not a fan of, anything really that resembles a talk shop, because I've seen the like history has been pretty much clear on where they eventually end up. And then on the broader point of the GNU, I was correct. Martin started off by saying, hey, he was wrong because he thought the GNU was going to collapse unless the GNU, well, I've been correct at the very least that the politicians are self-interested in maintaining the gravy boat that they are all now party to. And I don't think that it will be collapsing. You can hold your breath for the next 3 years. We're going to go into the next general election cycle, and we are still going to have a GNU. And it will be interesting to see what the future of that will look like. But I think that, the interest now it's even worse, right? Like now you've seen, GNU members meet the foreign president, one of the most important, really, and now they are tied at the hip, even though they may disagree and they may not like one another. But I think that they are tied at the hip. But yeah, on to end on that. I was right and Martin was wrong. Take that away, viewers. I was right.
Let me bring myself up there in the middle of the screen so Zakes can stop praising himself. I was right about most of my predictions about the GNU. And I think the most important one there, which Zakes just alluded to, is co-option. Co-option, co-option, co-option. They are now tied at the hip, and I think Zakes is completely correct about that. Leigh-Ann, any more thoughts on this national monologue that we're all going to be subjected to for the next 20, 30, 40 years?
Well, I think we're also, I'm going to throw a bit of a span in the works now, but we're all discussing this as if we're in a democracy in South Africa. I think it's a bit of an illusion, to be honest. Like I said, why do we need a national dialogue when we have public participation? And if you take, for example, on policies like NHI, even something as simple as the smoking ban during lockdown, you can get 1 million people saying, no, we're not interested. But if 2 people agree with the ANC, then they'll accept those comments. So that to me is not very democratic. So I think that could open up a whole nother conversation about democracy in South Africa. But yeah, that's basically my thoughts on it.
No, I think you're completely right. I mean, the thing that Zakes just brought up about NEDLAC, I mean, it should, like NEDLAC and all these things are, and the Constitution itself requires public participation. And for instance, if you look at like the tobacco bill recently, it's now the ramping up of getting that adopted into law is now kind of back on the scene after the excitement of the GNU of last year. And I've written quite a bit about this, but you will see in the report of the processes that happen in NEDLAC around it. So this is where kind of government engages with big tobacco and with the community and with labor unions, but like there's one example in that report from NEDLAC about the bill where the business formation, I think it just pointed out it's something like a spelling error or a kind of a logic error in the text. Like the business formation is disputing a lot of the other substantive things in the bill as well, but they just pointed this thing out, and like it's a table form where it's like, okay, business said this is government's response, business said this is government's response, and like in 80% of them, the government is like, oh, the government disagreed, so they're not changing the bill. And about that spelling error, it's like, also the government disagreed and they're not changing the bill. And it's like when you read something like that, you have this sense of, wow, really? Like, and I've experienced this myself. I haven't been to parliament a lot during public participation, but the few times that I did go, it was on the strength of a rule of law project submission. And the rule of law projects, the FMF rule of law project submissions don't really go too much into, oh, this is not free market, therefore we don't want it. It's more to say that there's a rule of law issue here, which is to say there is too much discretionary power, or something is too vague, or something is not kind of there's a contradiction in the bill. And many of those submissions that I went and presented to Parliament contained aspects like that, where it's like there's a contradiction. You're not going to achieve what you want to do, the bad things that you want to do, you're not going to achieve it because there's a contradiction here, and it's like you have to fix that. And they're just like, nah, why we're the government, we don't need to do that. So I mean, you're completely right. It's this mentality of, we are a democracy once every 5 or so years for a few hours, and then we stop being a democracy for the next 5 years, and then again we're back to being a democracy during the election cycle. And I think this kind of is a nice segue into a broader discussion on what happened in the aftermath of the very consequential election of 2024. So this national dialogue is very much in the context of the government of national unity. And now we celebrate or mourn the 1 year anniversary of this government. And the question is, has it worked? Has this thing been a desirable aspect of our political landscape? Has it been undesirable? And I think many people are going to be familiar with what my views are, and I'll just try and go over them briefly. And to say that we have now had perhaps South Africa's strongest opposition ever since the formation of this country, co-opted into the agenda of the ruling party. I think the DA isn't itself cohesive on this. I think there are many people in the DA, and potentially, I mean, Helen Ziller herself, if you look at some of her press statements, has been viciously against what the government is doing, what her government of national unity is doing. Whereas the DA deployees in the government, John Steenhuisen, Dean McPherson, and the others, have been, let's say, muted on opposing what the rest of the government is doing. So the DA clearly isn't of one mind about this. But what matters ultimately is, what does the DA do in practice? And what it has done in practice was to go along to get along with the ANC colleagues in the government. We saw this at the Oval Office meeting of President Donald Trump, where if I were the leader of the Democratic Alliance, I would have approached it very differently. I would have said, please, God, send us some kind of deliverance from the ANC. This guy sitting next to you, President Trump, is not a good leader. He is an absolutely atrocious leader, and we need something to happen to kind of break the crisis that is facing our country. That is how I would have approached it. That is not how John Steenhuisen approached
Martin,
it.
would you have called Donald Trump God?
No. I would have prayed to God and hoped that Donald Trump would have been one of the solutions that sent my way. But
that's some serious Trump delirium syndrome that you've got there.
yes, yeah, no. There are people who think along these lines, but no. I would have prayed to the actual God to send some solutions, and I would have hoped that that Oval Office meeting would have been an opportunity for a real kind of well, it was an opportunity for opposition formations to get very clear and very unequivocal about the issues in South Africa, and that's not what happened. That is simply not what happened. I think a lot of people think Steenhuisen did okay. He pointed to the EFF and MK as kind of the doomsday coalition. I think that was fine, but there are many other things that I think he could have made a far better contribution there. And then we have Dean McPherson effectively, and I know people can disagree in the margins, but effectively endorsing the Expropriation Act and saying this is basically okay. John Steenhuisen himself last year, or was it early this year, signed 2 Agri-BEE measures into law as part of his kind of portfolio as Minister of Agriculture, and then he defended doing that. He defended it at a press conference, very specifically defended that action. So I would say that's co-option of the opposition, and the DA has been the strongest opposition that South Africa has ever had since its DP days, even since its Progressive Party days, but specifically now in the democratic era, the DA has been a very strong opposition, and we've lost that. Hopefully, we can regain that at some point, but we've basically lost that. And then, of course, just other than the co-option, we haven't seen a marked change in policy. And David, you mentioned the deregulation of energy. Very notably, that happened during the ANC's hegemony. That was not part of a GNU outcome. So actually, we got some pro-market privatization reforms during the ANC days. I don't see much of that during the GNU days. In fact, my feeling has been that the temperature of South African politics has gone up, not down, since the formation of the GNU. It feels like there's a lot more radicalism going around. There's a lot more contestation over key issues like NHI, like EWC, and not contestation in the good way, as in, hey, we're getting rid of this, it's a bad idea, we're getting rid of it, but rather that we're ramping it up. Employment equity, we're ramping it up in the midst of this GNU thing. Even now, there's a new bill that Cabinet has approved. Cabinet has approved it. That means the DA has approved it as well with sufficient consensus. That makes it more difficult for the South Africans to hire foreign nationals, legal foreign nationals in this country. Makes it more difficult for them to do that. That is not, to me, a manifestation of a reform-minded kind of pro-business posture. So on the whole, I think the GNU has been bad for South Africa, and it probably has some benefits, maybe keeping the EFF MK out to some degree. I have questions about that, but I think on the whole, the 2024 election hasn't produced for us the type of reform that it would necessarily have produced in any other mature democracy, where a ruling party was so decisively brought beneath 50% and then gone into a coalition with almost exclusively pro-market, pro-business, pro-growth parties. I think there was a mismatch there, and that this is a mourning rather than a celebration after a year of GNU. Zakes, let's start with you. Maybe your thoughts. I know you and I have disagreed over the last year about some of this.
Yeah, yeah. And I think we may kind of still do, because I think you don't see, like, you lack perspective when you're looking at this thing. You just like offhandedly mention the other possible alternative to the GNU, and like, oh yeah, I have questions about that. Like, no. No. The questions are clear. You know, the alternative is that there is no, like, the whole point of adults in the room, right? There are none of them. And I don't know, man. Like, I wouldn't say the GNU has been great. I'd be lying. Hasn't been great. I want to see, labor reform. That is my one thing, because unemployment is kind of horrible. It is a national disaster. No one is kind of like taking it serious, and they're all just kind of chilling about it. And that has been the disappointing aspects of it. But like, I think what a lot of people are missing, right, is that, man, it can counterfactually, it can get worse. It can. And I know that seems like boogeyman going, oh no, how dare you? But like, it can get worse. And we lose sight of that when we are in a horrible situation, and we should always strive for more, but we should not lose sight of the fact that, like, it could have gotten worse. It could have gone worse. I prefer a Department of Basic Education run by Usiviwe that got rid of pit toilets. Like that, I prefer that than whatever alternative would have existed had she not been in that department. As I've told you plenty of times, I know a whole lot of people, foreign nationals even, who interact with the Department of Home Affairs a whole lot, like a whole lot. And I prefer the improvements, marginal as they may be. But if you don't go to the Home Affairs offices, you will not know this. But marginal as they may be, I prefer those, improvements, because there's someone at the executive level, at the very least, coming with different rhetoric, right? So, counterfactually, man, it can get worse. And for that reason alone, I think the GNU is kind of worth it. I get the people within it who are like kind of sticking it out. I'm like, man, I get it. They're in a very horrible position, because if they weren't there, then what is the alternative, right? The alternative is just either the same old ANC stuff, and or something much more worse, right? And that cannot be a possibility. And I think that's part of the frustration within the GNU itself, is we saw this in the budget. The ANC can get a majority without participation from the DA. Like, it can scrounge up, and this is something I'll give even people in the DA credit for, because they've been heavily opposed to the formation of small parties. I think it is counter to any democratic system to be opposed to the formation of other parties, but from a strategy perspective of wanting to see change, I see where they're coming from, because it is due to this myriad of small parties that generally are very amenable to the ANC, that we could have a situation whereby a budget that was like opposed, to Leigh-Ann's point, like, man, everyone opposed an increase in VAT, and that thing still went ahead. That was the most stark example of not having a democracy. But they wanted to go to put it ahead, had it not been for a court case that really stopped them, right? So like the idea that the DA can exert some form of pressure, be it inside or without, right? Pressure enough to dissuade the ANC from taking one of the most horrible decisions bore fruit. To me, as we spoke about this, I think it was at an event last year, and I was like, to me, the budget was gonna be where all the balls are at, because to me, that is where you decide what my taxes do. And they kind of fought, not even kind of, they fought the budget. Of course, they approved taxes in another manner by having a fuel levy. So did they fight? I may be arguing against myself, but they did fight against the VAT increase, right? They did fight against increases. They did, in rhetoric, speak against increases, in government expenditure. And to me, I always look at it from a policy perspective, right? As I told you, like, they are one of the few parties who have provided an alternative to the BEE with like elimination of race as a factor to consider, right, through their policy conference, if you actually look at their policy definition. So like, we will look at their next policy conference before the next general election, because that is what ought to dictate what their party does, at the very least, or what their party strives to do. So I hope that they stick to that, because by far, to me, they have the best policies, right, out of anyone, at the very least, who seems viable, of course, outside of any outright anarchist party that looks for the dissolution of the state. But other than that, really, they are pretty good. And I think they are being in the GNU, like, I wouldn't say South Africa is worse. South Africa is, for the mere fact that South Africa is not worse for it, it has to be better, right? It's like in an either or. Like, the fact that they are there, we are in a position that I think it is better had they not been there. But yeah, that is my view.
Our host is on mute.
Leigh-Ann, if you want to jump in on that, sorry.
Well, I can't really say that I was disappointed, because I wasn't expecting too much. But I do understand where a lot of DA voters were extremely disappointed, because leading up to the election, the DA said they would never go into a coalition with the ANC. They will never work with them. There was articles saying that the DA said that they would, and the DA came out and said, no, it's lies, it's fake news. They would never work with the ANC. And what happened? They joined the GNU. So I understand where that disappointment comes in. And also running up to the election was this message of, we are going to rescue SA. We are going to rescue you from the ANC. We are going to rescue you from NHI, Bella, EWC, all these terrible policies. And yet they were all signed into law after the formation of the GNU. So I think that one of the worst outcomes of this is the GNU is actually making the DA look bad. And they are going to lose quite a lot of voters, which is unfortunate. And where those voters are going to end up is scary. They may end up with parties like Good, some of the smaller guys, but and I can already see they've lost a lot of voters to the Patriotic Alliance. So especially in the Western Cape. So yeah, it's not looking good for them, to be honest.
No, absolutely. I think I can agree with that. David, any thoughts from your side?
Sorry, I couldn't find my unmute button there. Seems to be an affliction for all of us today on this pod. Yeah, so look, I think it goes back to the earlier comment that I was making around the ANC setting the agenda, which I think it is effectively done in the GNU. And I think I agree, Martin, that the DA is the most credible and strong opposition party that South Africa's had. If you think about it, ever. I mean, well, since 1994, at least. So, yeah, I think something that is a bit concerning is that the DA is often in reactive mode, responding to ANC policy proposals. There's a lack of good faith, particularly from the ANC, not telling the Minister of Public Works that you're going to sign the Expropriation Act, pushing through Bella. And I think the general public doesn't absorb the nuance very well. So if the education minister says, well, look, we're going to try and temper the worst aspects of the Bella Bill by introducing regulations and authorizations, and we're gonna push back against it. Ultimately, the binary, did Bella get passed? Yes or no? Yes. Public doesn't like that. So I think it's a big PR challenge for the DA. The other thing is, yes, Zakes is right. I mean, you go to the Department of Home Affairs, the queues are shorter, things are a bit more efficient. I went to the traffic department today to renew my license. I told everyone I'm not going to be on the pod. I've set aside the whole day for this bureaucratic nightmare. The whole place is falling apart, but it was pretty quick. I don't think that that's a Department of Home Affairs competency, but yeah, there were still COVID-19 stickers on the windows saying no mask, no entry. I was like, guys, it's been 5 years. But yeah, maybe it's one of those things you stop seeing, like the clutter in your house. But yeah, so I think that the main issue is, what is the DA's singular policy achievement out of the GNU? Like what we were talking about with the national dialogue, ultimately we need to have policy trade-offs and policy wins. And I can't really immediately point to anything. I think probably the high watermark for the DA was the VAT dispute. And I think that was good, because it illustrated my earlier point that South Africa needs conflict to resolve its problems rather than consensus. Like, we had reached the end of the fiscal road there. Like, you can't just take on more debt or increase taxes. Like the politics washed up against the reality of our public finances. And so, yeah, now you got to have a trade-off discussion. What expenditure are you going to cut? I think ultimately the VAT issue was more symbolic. It was kind of at the margins if you look at its total contribution to the fiscus. But we need to see a bit more of that, more fighting within the GNU. And I think that's appropriate. I don't think just because you're in government with another party that you have to necessarily toe the line. And I think there's a difference between understanding that you have to make compromises. Compromise is part of life. We don't always get what we want. But that doesn't mean that you have to endorse particularly the most nefarious policy decisions of your opponents or your coalition partners. So I think there's a lot of work to be done in terms of understanding how this GNU works. I think we're also stuck in a binary conversation, GNU good or not. But I think there are many different versions of how this can play out. And I think much more robustness. I was encouraged to see the DA taking the Employment Equity Amendment Act to court. EWC litigation, I think, is also good. You can operate in multiple domains simultaneously. I think maybe a good thing for the DA is that the ANC often dismissed the DA as apartheid apologists. And look, if you vote for these guys, they're going to take you back to the bad old days. And that obviously was a total smear and untrue. But now it's very hard for the ANC to kind of say that, like, oh, you're going to be sending us back in time. Voters are now experiencing life under a DA government, even if it's a kind of a substantially altered DA government. So yeah, if that sounds like a hedge, I'm trying to be nuanced, but yeah, I think there's good things and bad things. I think Zake's, your earlier point was around the counterfactual, like what happens if the MK or EFF gets into power. And I think at the conception in May last year, that was a real incredible threat. And so averting that, I think there was legitimacy in doing so. I think perhaps that risk was overstated given the bad political blood between particularly the political leaders of those respective parties, Ramaphosa, Malema, and Zuma. But I think that is one of the matters that will be revealed in the fullness of time. So if you look at the EFF, perhaps they've been weakened by the departure of some of their key lieutenants, fallouts with Malema. Jacob Zuma is having similar structural issues within his party. There's a lot of personality clash and so on. So that, I think, will be a bit clearer in the fullness of time. If those parties collapse, then I would say that the case for the GNU would have been stronger.
Yeah, I would want to echo a little bit of what you said there, David, and that is that and this is my big thing leading up to the formation of the GNU, was that the false binary of either an ANC-led government with the DA and coalition or an ANC government with the EFF and MK. That was to me a very unfortunate aspect of our discourse. And then I think the press, again, are so complicit in this because they fed it, and they fed it with the DA and they fed it with everyone else. This idea that somehow, by some force of magic, our whole political system, the whole landscape of coalition politics that you see so blooming so wonderfully around the world, of how in how many different ways it could be configured and what different things can happen. Suddenly it's just like, no, it's ANC EFF or it's ANC DA, and everyone just went with that, and it was so unfortunate. That was we really handicapped ourselves as a society by limiting our imagination in that way. Of course, ANC EFF, ANC MK, or all three of them together was one of the many alternatives that could happen. And of course, that is the worst possible thing that could have happened. I am not sure that out of the many alternatives, we should have kind of stared into that, because one of the alternatives, and this is what David alluded to, and this is what we saw a little bit of with the VAT increase, is that a ANC with various partners that stand up kind of for what's right. So a GNU with backbone, kind of a DA with backbone in the GNU. That is one of the alternatives that we have, and we saw some of that, but we usually do not see any of that whatsoever. It's actually very rare to see a DA with backbone in the GNU as an alternative to a DA without backbone. You see little kind of spurts of it that kind of it flashes, like when Ramaphosa said something positive, did something positive to do with Russia, and then Leon Schreiber announced something positive of Ukraine from his department's perspective. And I was like, yes, that right there, that kind of tit for tat approach, and that's that. I mean, welcome to the world of coalition politics. That is the conflict that you want to see. You shouldn't do anything that necessarily, obviously, is going to lead to a loss. But there are many examples. The one that my kind of big interest is expropriation of health compensation. That's what I've been working on for the last, 8 years. It's been my primary research focus. Is for Dean McPherson to go onto a stage and defend the act, He didn't have to do that. He would have kept his job if he didn't do that. He would have kept his job if he stuck with what he had previously said, which is this act is unacceptable. I will not co-sign it. This is an unconstitutional law. Here's a legal opinion that I had drafted that says why it's unconstitutional. I cannot, as someone who has sworn an oath to uphold and protect the Constitution, sign this act. So that was the correct 100% correct posture for him to take. And then he went quiet, and then suddenly he's now in favor of the act. Yes, the DA is still litigating against the act, more power to them, but their minister, their guy in Pretoria, is in favor of the act. Now, the question for me, the alternative to that is not having Julius Malema as Minister of Public Works. The alternative to that for me is having Dean McPherson as Minister of Public Works without doing simply retarded stuff like that. Like, do not do stupid shit. Like, that cannot be that difficult. Do not concede your whole policy foundation to your enemy. I mean, that must go without saying. John Steenhuisen, when his, I don't know, probably not his chief of staff at the time, but someone else brought him his agri BEE stuff. Now, if I were him, I would have said, listen, I am a busy man. You get that stuff out of my face. I don't want to see it. I don't want to hear from you about these things. I don't care about these things. Take it away. I am the minister. I am responsible for agri BEE regulations in my department. I do not want to see this. Do not speak to me about it. That's what John Steenhuisen should have done. What did he do? He said, oh, look, agri BEE, there's my signature. There it goes. Agri BEE, there's my signature. There it goes. And then he would have the temerity to say at the press release, oh, but it's the law. It's the law. It's the law. Suddenly we care about it's the law. How many ministerial positions in this country? We have at least 32 ministries in this government. Each of them has multiple pieces of legislation that require that the minister in that department adopt some kind of regulation. They don't all exist. Like, I promise you, kind of take it from me. There are many regulations that should exist that do not exist. Those ministers are not being wrapped kind of on the knuckles for, it's the law. Where's the regulations? Where's the regulations? But no. We have the DA now. So the DA is going to implement agri BEE because, well, you see the little black text on the white paper says we must implement agri BEE, despite the fact that when we went to the polls on the 29th of May, 2024, we did so and received a mandate from our voters that we are an anti-BEE party and that we will not implement BEE. That was the democratic mandate. That is the raison d'etre for John Steenhuisen and Dean McPherson and Ashor Sharupan and Dion George. All of them are there on the premise of that mandate. I don't care that the president has to appoint them and that they serve at the pleasure of the president. If they did not receive that mandate from their voters, they would not be there. So that is, you cannot separate their existence in the government from the democratic mandate that they received. Now, David is right. That doesn't mean you don't ever compromise. Of course, you must compromise. Sometimes you have to compromise. But what is a compromise? A compromise is you give something, I get something. I get something, you give something. That is, it's a reciprocal relationship. That's what compromise means. That has not happened in this government of national unity. That has not been insisted upon. That has not been forced. Even with the VAT thing, as Jakes alluded to, it's like this was not a give and take thing. This was the ANC just repackaged their VAT increase in the form of a fuel levy, and I've already seen some economists saying that this is going to be more of a burden to the economy than the VAT increase would have been. So, I mean, is that now a compromise? Again, I think it's great that the DA fought that fight. I think you need to see more of that, but ultimately, they still allow themselves to be outmaneuvered by the ANC. Of course, they're in a difficult position. Of course, this is not easy. There's nothing easy about this. But we cannot say that everything the DA is doing and failing to do is the best that they could do. I think that it would be very reckless of anyone to maintain such a position. I think the DA is doing much worse than it could be doing if it just took a deep breath, took a step back, climbed out of Cyril Ramaphosa's ass and asked, what do our voters want? What do our voters want? What is our mandate here? And then, yes, you can compromise around that. You cannot take Cyril Ramaphosa's position as your default and then compromise around that. That is the wrong approach. So yeah, that's kind of a long story from me that the alternative to a bad GNU is a good GNU. Yes, one of the other alternatives is an EFF ANC government, but let's stick to the alternative to a bad GNU being a good GNU. And I mean that's what I would have preferred. And I don't think we're seeing nearly enough of that. Leigh-Ann, I see you're unmuted.
But Martin, just to come back to the agri BE legislation, right? What is the difference? What is the point of the GNU then, right? What is the point of the DA being there if they have to just sign what the ANC wants them to sign? What's the difference between John Steenhuisen being there versus just another ANC cadre or comrade? To me, it's pointless.
John Steenhuisen will implement it much better than the ANC comrade. So I think I've often said that the best thing that ever happened to the ANC was getting the DA to come and implement their bad policy ideas, because the DA can actually implement these things. So that's horrible. that's absolutely horrible. But
I have some.
okay. Yeah, David.
So I thought it might be useful if I just share my screen for a moment. To just look at the original statement of intent and go back in time to those halcyon days of May and June 2024. And, so there's a lot of, in the preamble, this historical juncture, we need to, unite and stop being divisive and so on. And, we commit to the constitutional principles, but then also some of these foundational principles of the GNU, which are kind of start off in quite a high-minded way, and nothing I would disagree with here. Respect for the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. I think constitutionalism, that's definitely something we would get behind. Non-racialism and non-sexism, very important. But then, and I think this shows that it's kind of a grab bag of everything. It's like everyone's got something that they like about the statement of intent and something that they don't like. So social justice, I mean, that's a very loaded term. We prefer just normal justice to social justice. Evidence-based policy and decision-making, a professional merit-based, non-partisan developmental public service. So these are sort of like fairly innocuous. I mean, no one can disagree with this motherhood and apple pie kind of stuff. But I think further down, that's where things get interesting. So, and I think this section 16 is very important. So the GNU shall be constituted in a manner that reflects genuine inclusiveness of political parties that are party to the statement of intent, taking broadly into account the number of seats parties have in the National Assembly and the need to advance the national interest. And the president, he has the prerogative to appoint ministers, but he must do so in consultation with the leaders of the respective parties. I mean, I think that principle has been honored more in the breach than anything else over the last year. And then that favorite buzzword of South African politics, consensus. Where no consensus is possible, the principle of sufficient consensus shall apply. I think that was much disputed in the aftermath. During the negotiated transition in the 1990s, when Cyril Ramaphosa and Rolf Meyer were the principal negotiators for the ANC and the National Party, respectively, sufficient consensus meant if the National Party and the ANC can agree, then everyone else can get stuffed. But I don't really think that the DA has the same kind of weight in the GNU as the NP had during those constitutional negotiations. And again, some of these kind of weasel terms, all parties have had the opportunity to express their views. So you can express yourself until you're blue in the face, but what matters is, are you listened to and do your words translate into actions? And then this as well, parties to the GNU representing 60% of seats in the National Assembly agree. remind me, Martin, what was the debate that Fikile Mbulula was having with Helen Zille about that? Does that mean total 60% of seats in the National Assembly or 60% of the GNU itself?
Yeah, I can't remember what they were specifically debating, but if you look at the plain meaning there, I think it's clear that it means that if you take everyone in the GNU, that's ANC, DA, good PA, etc., and you have a disagreement about policy, the question is, out of us here in the GNU, what combination of us get us over 60%? And then when you have that, you have now succeeded in achieving sufficient consensus. And that the only way to do that with the current configuration of the GNU is with the ANC, which by itself represents, my goodness, it represents 40% of the seats in the National Assembly. The DA represents, give or take, 20. That's the only way for the parties in the GNU to reach that 60%. So the ANC, with everyone else, would not reach 60% of the seats in the National Assembly. So to me, this was always clear, and that's why I've always been kind of strict on the fact that anything that cabinet approves has been approved by both the ANC and the DA, at least by implication, because that's what 19.3 to me very evidently means.
Yeah, so I think there's so many ways in which this could have played out. Just to the earlier point, and I think the ANC often operates with a lack of good faith in its interpretation of the statement of intent. And perhaps it's time for some of the other parties to get a bit more Machiavellian and start asserting their interests and their constituencies' interests at the expense of good relations with their coalition partners.
Yeah. So I think a key thing that kind of flows from this discussion, and that's maybe very relevant to us in the FMF this week, is that and we've now brought it up a few times, one of the key policy, I almost want to say one of the policy foundations of the new South Africa, which is called broad-based Black economic empowerment, I should say so-called, has now existed for many years, first in a voluntary form in the 1990s, and then from 2003 onwards, it acquired legislative character, and then it's been primarily in terms of that BEE Act, BBBEE Act, and its various sector codes and charters, but also in multitudes of the race laws that we have in South Africa today also have BEE adjacent kind of provisions that also refer back to that original BEE Act. And for I think the first time in post-apartheid South Africa, there has now been a quantified research study published on the harms of BEE. Now, very difficult exercise, and then very self-consciously this report, which was co-published by the Solidarity Research Institute and the Free Market Foundation, very self-consciously, it's about the absolute minimum quantifiable direct compliance costs of BEE, because and in my view, perhaps the bigger cost of BEE is when some international businessman thinks, well, I want to invest in the African market. Where's the best place to start? Of course, South Africa. Okay, let me see how I can invest there. Oh, I need to dilute my own ownership. Oh, geez, I need to dilute my own. I can't appoint my own managers. I have to take these things into account. Kenya, let me go to Kenya. That cannot be quantified because the thing just never happened. So that to me is probably the biggest cost, but ultimately there is a direct compliance cost that comes with complying with BEE, and our researchers, which the head researcher from our side was Dr. Mornay Malan, senior associate with the Free Market Foundation. I contributed a little bit to that paper. Zakes, you contributed a little bit to that paper, and our intern and associate Ayanda Zulu contributed a bit to that paper. So team effort, and then from Solidarity side, Tiens Dubison was their lead researcher, and they had contributions from other researchers, and I think Connie Mulder also probably contributed from their side. But what they've come to is a 5 trillion rand figure. What BE has cost South Africa, I think, over a period, and that has been quantified also by analogy to the amount of jobs, the amount of growth that has cost. I think that number was up to about 3% of yearly GDP growth, and then that has, through the application of so-called Okun's law, translated into how many jobs that has cost the economy. So we have a press release that we'll link to as well. 192,000 annual job opportunities lost due to the cost that is that companies have to spend on BE. That's almost 200,000 jobs every year. And I think what we said at the press conference this week was that in total, that's about 3-4 million South Africans would have been working today if we didn't have this burden, this whole policy paradigm burden squeezing a lot of dynamism and so on out of our economy. Of course, this is not the only area in which South Africa is overregulated. Zakes referred to competition policy earlier, and the competition policy has a lot of BE stuff, but other than the BE stuff, there's also still a lot of discretionary nonsense in there that allows competition authorities to just kind of bring normal economic transactions to a grinding halt. So this is not all there is, but I think that this is an important piece of research that we invite everyone to have a look at. And it's one of those things that one would have hoped would have been at least diluted under the GNU, not implemented more efficiently, like John Steenhuisen probably is doing in the Department of Agriculture. So yeah, let's maybe spend some time on this research report. Zakes, I don't know if you have anything to add at this early stage.
Hold on. Yeah. As you said, I contributed to the report, on competition policy. So I guess that would be, my focus usually is restricted to that. And I don't know, man, the market, any inefficiency is always going to be horrible. As I told you, my most ideal scenario is that there be no competition policy. So you just only think that you have competition policy and then we have really a duplication of actual regulation just from a technical level. It is never good. Just have one piece of legislation deal with whatever it is that is. I think it will even make our jobs much more easier because we just have to focus on that one piece of legislation, not have, say, having to do competition, legal research, and someone does procurement, and another has to do actual quantifiable data from, like it is a lot. But yeah, man, this thing, Martin, I think you're right. Opportunity cost really is the most important thing, right? Like the consequences are much, I guess, easier to see, but the unseen is really what we are kind of losing sight of. It's the unseen economic activity, and in the competition space, right? Legislation like this just gets absurd, right? The Burger King example is the most stark one, whereby it kind of even goes against what it aims to achieve because of its strict uniformity, the uniformity of law, the strict nature of law, and like what the word says should go. And you'd end up in a situation whereby people who are considered historically disadvantaged owning a piece of capital and wanting to sell it, and they can't sell it to anyone other than someone who's also historically disadvantaged, because if they sell it to someone who's not historically disadvantaged, it'll skew the ownership patterns, and that would undermine the purpose of whatever the Competition Act seeks to achieve. So, absurd things like that. Of course, you're fortunate enough if you're, I guess, deal is big enough that it will attract the attention of the minister, and then you will be given an exemption. But what happens about deals that are just making the threshold of being, considered by the Competition Commission, but not big enough for them to be considered by the minister, right? Like all the myriad, what I would assume a majority of, mergers, just to focus on that aspect alone, right? That the commission deals with all those aspects. And the horrible part is that the intent behind said legislation would be the upliftment of said historically disadvantaged persons, but given the nature of it, it ends up undermining that. And I think even in the job aspects, right, like unemployment is highest among historically disadvantaged people. So if you're going to have a legislation that creates even more unemployment, that will disproportionately affect the people you're trying to uplift. It undermines that, right? It undermines that. I'm a principled argue, like you know this, Martin. I'm a principled guy. Consequences be damned in most cases than not, right? But I hope that the consequences of the horrible decisions, as a reasonable person, you can be at least convinced by empirical data. I hope that people are convinced by empirical data and maybe they begin to reconsider that. Our best option really is to just vote differently. I think that is really our best option. Of course, use whatever option we have in our litigation, our constitution. Also, maybe if we have a different bench that may decide to interpret our constitution how it's supposed to be interpreted, but that is a much more long-term thing, and that also is changed by how we vote. But we hope that the people who do vote are convinced, most especially the media, right? They'll first have to admit that this is a problem, but it is hard to, ignore something when there's actual theoretical data. I know the academics on the other side will be hopefully pouring through the report itself, trying to find holes, as is usually the case, right? And I find that disheartening because it just makes the issue, we don't talk about the issue, we talk about what the report is, how it's structured, and how it's misrepresentative and misinformed. I'm like, man, we can really just talk about the issue itself. You can just say, I support this for this, and not just try and attack the thing that is facilitating the discussion of the issue. So I hope that becomes the case too. But yeah, I'm not convinced by empiricism, but I know other people are. So I hope it convinces other people, because that's we have to, with the unemployment aspects. I think that's the point that is most important, man. Like, we have a disaster on our heads, like millions of people aren't working, and like, if you think that if you can change that by just changing a law, like, how that's an easy dub as a politician. I don't know why they aren't going for these easy dubs. So we hope that they'll consider that and go for the easy dubs.
Yeah, and I just before we go to Leigh-Ann, I just wanted to re-emphasize something that you kind of just alluded to there, and that is that if you are a black South African and you own shares, you are in many cases not allowed to sell your shares to anyone other than a black South African. I mean, a lot of people instinctively, and a lot of foreigners specifically, when they hear about these laws, they immediately go to this, oh, it's an anti-white, it's kind of anti-white stuff, it discriminates against white people. And I think, yes, that does happen. Obviously, it's kind of in the nature of the thing, but that doesn't mean that there aren't direct victims of this policy in the black community as well. Another example is that if you are a, let's say, 100% black owned accounting firm, whatever, 100%, it's a family business, and you think, my goodness, we really want to merge our firm with a 50% black owned company there across the road, and we want to become one firm, you're going to have to go to the competition commission and say, hey, yeah, we want to do this. And they're going to be like, yeah, but you're 100% black owned thing. If you merge with a 50% black owned company, then the final company is only going to be, I can't do math, 75% black owned. So that dilutes the amount of transformation in the economy, is what the competition commission could say. And now they say, sorry, not approved. We're not approving you as a historically disadvantaged firm, your request to merge with another. And then even over and above that, there's criterions that the competition commission has to take into account about whether what you're doing in your business has a, I don't think they use the word disproportionate, but they say if it has a disproportionate anti-competitive effect on businesses owned by previously disadvantaged people. So one of the things that they have to take into account for price discrimination, for anti-competitive behavior, is the effect that that behavior has on on businesses owned by historically disadvantaged people in the economy. So even if you are a 100% black owned business and you do what in the rest of the world would be considered normal economic activity, you're competing with other companies. You want to win, actually. The competition commission will be like, no, but what you're doing is so unfair to other historically disadvantaged businesses, and therefore you can't do that. Here's a big fine, and let's settle on 100 million rand or whatever, and and there we go. So it's actually a problem. And the same applies with land reform, for example. If you are a black person, you've received land through restitution, or in many cases in housing, if you've received a house and so on, and you want to now, you're now the owner. They call you the owner, like they're lying to you, but you're now the owner, and you want to sell this property to someone, to a white person, to an Indian person, a colored person, or to a black person from Nairobi or from Lagos. They always say, no, you can't do that. This is empowered land, so you're only allowed to sell this property to another black South African. And when they say that, they mean someone who we have approved as the high-minded politicians, and that will usually be a comrade or a cater. So I think that's just a very important thing to note when people think about so-called BEE policies and South Africa's race laws. It might have these nice sounding racial kind of justice terminology, but ultimately it's very much applied against black South Africans as well, even though it's portrayed as being only applied in their favor. Leigh-Ann, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I think that there's a misconception that BE isn't working. I think it's working exactly as it was intended to, which is to benefit the elite. If it was truly to uplift people, the criteria would have been your economic standing. And the wealthy and the elite would have been excluded from that. And because the argument is, right, that white people are rich, black people are poor, therefore we need black economic empowerment. Why then, if that is the case, why not just have economic empowerment, and you would therefore uplift the poor anyway? And that's always been my question. But they knew that the Cyril Ramaphosa's, the Patrices, that they wouldn't benefit if that was the case. So that's my view on BE. And if they really wanted to uplift people, why not build trade colleges? It doesn't help to have these top level, we're going to transform management. We've got an oversupply of unskilled workers in South Africa. Why not give these people skills? Why can't we have more plumbers, more electricians, more people who have actual skills? And I think that would be the real BEE, is if we implemented those things, instead of discussing who will get 51% in existing businesses.
No, completely, exactly. And they knew that Cyril Ramaphosa wouldn't become Ronald McDonald and establish McDonald's. And I imagine if we didn't have BE, McDonald's wouldn't exist. So I think that there's at least some logic to that thinking. David?
Yeah, I think we don't want to bang on about the president all the time on this pod, but he was one of the initial instigators of BE. I think he was one of the, if not the original chair of the BE Commission as well. So he has a very strong vested interest in this. And obviously, as we were discussing last week, he really doubled down on BE. And yeah, I think just first of all, I wanted to say a huge shout out to Dr. Morne Malan. I think he did some really excellent work together with Tiens de Buisson on solidarity. But yeah, also, as you mentioned, Martin, a lot of great support from people like Zags, Ayanda, and many others along the value chain. So yeah, definitely worth a read. And yeah, I think we would actually welcome some strong interrogation of it. And I think something that was quite notable at the press conference yesterday in Melrose Arch was that actually this is almost the first of its kind, that there hasn't really been a proper impact study done on BE. It's supposedly this cherished cornerstone of public policy in South Africa, but no one's really taken the time to engage with it. And I think that's a feature of the sensitivity around it, that if you seem to actually kind of pull back the curtain and say, well, what's actually happening here? What are the real effects of BE? It's almost like you don't want to know what the real effects will be. So just to recap some of those numbers, the estimated cost on the economy per year is between 149 billion and 290 billion rand. I wish Mornay was on the pod to explain how that was calculated. It's quite a large range, obviously, but that's because they were using, third-party data and so on. But what I think, and Monet mentioned this yesterday at the press conference, that's just the kind of known costs, that 2% to 4% of GDP per year. There's also this enormous effect of opportunity cost, which is invisible and which you don't see. And that's an investor sitting in London or wherever and looking at the situation in South Africa and saying, oh, gosh, I don't want to be transferring 30% equity to some silent partner that I've never met. And how do I know I'm going to be able to trust that person? Will they add value to this transaction? And so they just quietly move their capital somewhere else. And so that's not a cost that you're registering necessarily. And in terms of jobs, that reducing GDP growth by between 1.5 and 3% per year is net effect of that is between 96,000 and 192,000 jobs lost every year. So in an economy where we're desperate for jobs, 32% unemployment, that is really an absolute travesty. So I think, there's the kind of the empirical cold numerical effect of BE, but there's also a clear human cost here. And there is a moral case against BE, I think. And often BE is dressed up in moral terms. And I think to a large extent, those are valid concerns. We have a history of discrimination. Black people were locked out of economic participation in the economy. And you need to have inclusivity, to use an overworn term. And so the aspiration of having meaningful wealth creation for Black South Africans, a flourishing Black business community, those are noble ends. And I'm paraphrasing Piet Leroux of Zakhele here in a video that I'll post in the chat. But the end is noble, but the means with which policymakers have engaged in that, I think, has been very damaging and nefarious. And I hate to admit it, but I think I agree with Leigh-Ann's assessment that this was baked into the design of the policy. It wasn't just a kind of an unintended effect. And ultimately, as Piet Leroux will remind us, BE is the politicization of the economy. It should actually be called BPE, the Black political empowerment, because it's the politicians that get empowered. So yeah, those are just some of my high-level thoughts. Do check out the report. We did get lambasted by the Black Business Council as they took issue with our analysis. Zakes, they dismissed it as unempirical. I don't know if that counts as a criticism in your books. You probably see it as flattery. But I think to Zakes' point as well, you actually have to have a principled opposition to these things, because if you say, okay, well, fine, we'll concede that you need 20% equity transfer, well, then why not 30%? Why not 40%? If you've already conceded the principle. And so what's interesting, and the paper goes into this, there's a kind of a genealogy of BE and how it's evolved. And in the early days, it was actually quite aspirational, pretty vague, like, hey, we recognize the injustices of the past. Let's move towards greater representation at management level and so on. Kind of touchy-feely stuff. But very quickly thereafter, the BE regulations become codified, become much more stringent, enforceable, and if you breach those regulations, then there's harsh penalties. And that's over quite a quick period. So that ratcheting up is very evident. And I see Gail Day in the comments, our colleague. She says, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. The goal of Black empowerment is honorable. It is not achievable by negative interventions in the economy. It is achievable through economic growth. And I think that's such an important point by Gail, that we should, when we talk about growth, we're not just talking about number go up. Growth enriches the lives of people, and every percentage of economic growth results in hundreds of thousands of net new jobs created. And conversely, a reduction in growth impacts people materially in their lives. You literally are increasing mortality rates and lowering life expectancy and lowering quality of life. Yeah, and I think, there is also a myth, and it underpins the BE narrative, that if we didn't have BE, then Black people would just be locked out of economic opportunity in perpetuity. And I think it's very important to counter that and to say, well, actually, Black people have agency. They are aspirational. People who want to better themselves will do so, given the right environment and a removal of impediments. And even during apartheid itself, as John Kane Berman, the late former CEO of the IRR, wrote in a book called The Silent Revolution, even despite all of those restrictions, Black South Africans were moving to the cities in search of economic opportunity, and were often developing themselves and starting businesses, in spite of the apartheid restrictions. So can you imagine what incredible wealth and opportunity we can create by just removing race-based laws and all of this politicization of the economy? I think South Africa has huge untapped potential.
I couldn't have ended it any better than that, David. I think that's a very important note, and that is our time for today, ladies and gentlemen. I think this was a very good discussion about what's happened this week around the monologue, the bittersweet maybe performance of the GNU, but specifically the failure now at the end that we've noted of this one key policy dimension in South Africa's policy landscape, kind of almost defining policy intervention of the last 2 decades, that is really acting as a brake on our economy, even though it is dressed up in flowery language. So yeah, that's it for us. I want to thank everyone on the panel for joining again today, especially Leigh-Ann. Thank you very much for taking time out of your day and joining us. It's really been great to have you, and I'm fairly certain, in fact, I insist that it's not the last time. So we will definitely have you on again soon. But
Thanks for having me.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And we encourage everyone to please also follow Leigh-Ann on X, on Twitter. That's at SkyZA. I think. Yeah, I think that's correct, right? Yeah. Cool. And then of course also follow us on X at Rational Stand. Rational Standard is primarily a Substack-based platform, so please head on over to rationalstandard.com and restack us, like our content there, and share it with others on your Substack. On YouTube, please remember to like this video if you enjoyed the content, subscribe to this channel, click the bell icon if you want to receive a notification when we upload our any new weekly videos. And please share it on all the other platforms like Facebook and so forth. And given that we're primarily a Substack-based platform, we also have a lot of great written content on there. I mentioned earlier that Leigh-Ann's articles are our best performing one. So if you want to see more from her in the written format, you'll find it there. And from all of us as well, you'll find a lot of our writing there. Ladies and gentlemen, that's it. We will see you again next week. Cheerio.
Bye, everyone.